Hello, and welcome to Lynnhaven River Now's Sustainable Lawn Care webinar. It's a pleasure to have you all with us this evening. I'm Helen Coons, the Assistant Director of Lynnhaven River Now. Before I give you a bit of background, let me introduce the staff who are making this evening possible. First, I would like to introduce Emily Hatfield, our Information Systems Coordinator, whom you are unable to see. She is behind the scenes genius who is making tonight's technology happen. Thank you, Emily. I would also like to introduce Barbara Duke, our Sustainable Yards Program Coordinator. She will be monitoring the question and answer box, helping our guest speaker answer your specific questions at the end of his talk. I would like to share a few housekeeping items with you before we begin. You will notice that when you sign on, that your video is off and your audio is muted. We're on a tight schedule this evening, so we will be answering all questions at the end of the talk. Please submit your questions through the question and answer box. The Q&A box for most of you will be found at the bottom of your screen. Take a second to locate that in case you may have some questions as we move through. Don't hesitate to ask your question when you think of it. We just know that we won't be addressing them until the end. Any questions that don't get answered this evening will be answered through email. Lynnhaven River Now is Virginia Beach's leading environmental organization whose sole mission is to have clean and healthy waterways in Virginia Beach. Whether you live in the southern watersheds along Back Bay or the North Landing River, or you live in the northern portion of the city and may live along Broad Bay or Little Creek, you impact your local waterway every day. Our job at Lynnhaven River Now is to work with you, our neighbors, to understand and learn how to live gently along these waters so that we can enjoy and rely on them for years to come. Lynnhaven River Now works with faith communities, businesses, schools, residents, and neighborhoods to help develop sustainable practices that protect our water. We work to restore critical habitats that improve the health of our rivers and streams, such as tree buffers and oyster reefs. Reducing the pollutants that flow from our neighborhoods into our waterways has improved the health of the Lynnhaven River dramatically, and we are working to apply these same principles across the city. With that, let me introduce a longtime friend of Lynnhaven River Now. Cutler Robinson, Urban Nutrient Planner and President of Robinson's Agronomic Consulting LLC, has a Master of Science from Virginia Tech in plant physiology. Cutler comes from a field notorious for unsustainable practices, the golf course industry, but has spent most of his career developing and managing a system of greens and buffered ponds right here in Virginia Beach that has been recognized as a model of sustainability across the US and abroad. More recently, he has worked with Barbara Duke as an integral part of our Sustainable Yards program team. If you reside in the Lynnhaven River watershed and have gotten a Pearl lawn plan this year, Cutler has provided the analysis and suggestions for your individualized plan. Cutler, it's really good to see you, my friend. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Helen. It's good to be here. So yeah, we're here to talk about sustainable lawn care and how to manage your turf and protect the Lynnhaven River, and we can all do this. So the goal will be to provide a landscape for any homeowner or property owner that's both functional and aesthetic purposes while protecting and enhancing the surrounding environment, all at a reasonable expenditure of money and time, and to manage to reduce inputs so that you have this, that's the essence of sustainability. So when we talk about pollutants to the Lynnhaven, one of the obvious ones is the runoff that occurs from erosion and sediments that can carry bacteria and pollution. And as you may drive through your neighborhood or down the streets during a heavy rainstorm and you see muddy waters, rest assured that's not good for the Lynnhaven. So we're going to talk today about how we can do things to protect it. That sediment will be carrying nutrients, which is excess nutrients for the Lynnhaven above and beyond what it's naturally going to be able to handle. But it can also carry things like pesticides and other pollutants, bacteria and things like that. So runoff is the enemy, not runoff, but erosion is the enemy of the Lynnhaven, one major enemy of the Lynnhaven. So as a homeowner or property owner, one great way to develop a plan that's simple and easy, and if it's convenient, is to find the plat of your property. And then take a colored pencil or pens and draw your little landscape plan, and have that, you could have a plan that's the existing plan and let it, or an imaginary future plan, and let it guide your decision making. An aspect of that will be to assess how much turf grass you have. So we're going to promote having minimal turf grass. But where you have turf grass, we're going to talk about how to manage it properly and in great sustainability. In addition to that, with the plat, you're going to also want to look at how the water flows off your property. So we all know a homeowner is going to want to keep the water from building up against their house or under their crawl space. But what we also want to do is we want to make sure that the water that leaves your property is clean and pristine. And this is all reasonably achievable. So on your plat and your landscape design, take in consideration how this water flows across and develop plant materials that will help filter and act as little buffers on your property that will help absorb sediments and protect the Lynnhaven. Let your site be your guide. So one of the things I will say to all property managers, whether it's a golf course or a homeowner or industrial corporate industrial facility, is when you're growing plant materials, let nature be your guide. Let its particular site steer the plant materials. We will want to incorporate native plants when at all possible. So why do you incorporate native plants? There's lots of reasons. One is for wildlife, because they've evolved and adapted to the native plants, and they use our native plants as hosts and food and protection. But also native plants are adapted to this area, and they are less prone for diseases, so they require less pesticide treatments and things like that. So use native plants when all possible, and let your site dictate what plants are best. In this urban setting that we all live in, we want to have a harmonious landscape design. And we'd love to have this ground cover that protects the Lynnhaven from erosion, that carries sediments with excess nutrients and bacteria and things. And then we'd like to have it aesthetically pleasing, where you have these contrasts of shapes and forms and colors. And this is an example of whether you can have some turf grass and herbaceous plants, a perennial ground cover. Even you can use moss if it's adapted and going to grow well. But in the lower right portion of this slide, you can see where the attempt to grow moss was ill-advised because the site doesn't call for it, it's too sunny. So why do you use turf grasses when we all want to use native grasses? Native plants. We want to use native plants throughout our landscape as best possible. But turf grasses are excellent at erosion control. They stabilize the soil fabulous when they're managed properly. They're really essential as a ground cover for safety, visibility, intersections, and things like that. And they have a physical traffic tolerance that can handle activity. In addition, turf grasses provide a cooling effect. They absorb rains, they're carbon sink, and they do have an aesthetic value when they're properly maintained. Turf grasses are utilitarian. We use them. We congregate, we have social activities, we cook out, and we play sports on it. So it's a great plant. They're a great type of plant to have, and they're not that hard to maintain. So what is the turf grass? In the plant kingdom, you have grasses and you have turf grasses. So the grasses are monocots, and they can be corn as a grass, rice, wheat, rye, sugarcane. They're all grasses. But a turf grass is different. It's related, and it's a monocot, but it's evolved from the pressure of fire and grazing. And so it's late in this evolutionary series of plants, right? Because grazing didn't occur until recently. And then their growing point has evolved to be down near the ground. And that has allowed us to maintain them with mowing and things like that. So it's a really interesting, so that's a turf grass plant. There's two groups of turf grass plants, and they've evolved in adaptation to their climatic and geographic regions. And we call them cool season and warm season. They have what in the science world, C3 is a metabolic pathway, C4 is a different one. So The cool season grasses have a different metabolic pathway, and they're adapted to high latitudes, cool weather. The warm season grasses are adapted to warm temperatures, long, hot, humid, or even hot and dry, but hot weather. Unfortunately for Virginia, we live in the transition zone. And in the turf industry, we describe that as being the area where neither warm season or cool season grasses grow easily. And that is somewhat true. And that's why you'll see some lawns next to each other, one be tall, be a cool season grass, and then the next lawn down the street would be a warm season grass. We'll go back to that concept of let your site be your God. So we'll talk about that some more. But the transition zone also means we're at the northern latitude of the warm season grasses and the southern end of the cool season grasses, and they don't grow perfectly either. So cool season grasses, the most common one you'll see in the lawn around here will be tall fescue. And that's a species, and it has been bred, and there's lots of genetic variations of it. And it's easily, it's a big seed producer, and it's easily established through seed. Fine fescue is another cool season grass that's highly adapted to shade, but not adapted to traffic. You see some Kentucky bluegrass, some perennial ryegrass, some creeping bentgrass. They're also cool season grasses, but they are less commonly used in this area. And that's an example of a tall fescue lawn in the fall. The warm season grasses primarily used in our Hampton roads would be Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, and St. Augustine grass. Bermuda grass is very heat and drought tolerant. It's moderately pest tolerant, but it's very shade intolerant. Zoysia grass actually can handle the shade, and it's heat and drought tolerant, but it's susceptible to diseases, and it's a little coarser natured. St. Augustine is also adapted to the shade like zoysia grass, but it's even more coarse textured. And it's a little less cold tolerant. So here's examples of warm season grasses. On the left is zoysia, on the right is Bermuda grass. And this is a warm season grass. They have adapted a method of withstanding cold temperatures through dormancy. And this dormant period can be unsightly to some people, but when it's a well-maintained warm season grass in dormant condition can be quite attractive as well. So when you have your warm season, your cool season grasses, how do you manage them? Or what are the management characteristics? So they have a genetic propensity to handle certain things like a mowing height. And here's your list. And so tall fescue, very few tall fescues can handle being mowed too low. If you mow grass outside its area of adaptation, then it's going to be weakened and susceptible to pests, and then thin areas and possible erosion and sediment, erosion into the Lynnhaven. So tall fescue should be mowed 3 to 4 inches. It's got moderate water use, moderate pest susceptibility, and somewhat shade tolerant. Fine fescue is very shade tolerant, but you have to mow it real tall. Bermuda grass, there's several varieties of Bermuda grass, but with Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, and St. Augustine, the plant breeders haven't been able to develop them where they are easily established from seed. There is a common Bermuda grass that will come up by seed, but zoysia and St. Augustine, their seeds don't do well here, so they're slow to establish. But you see their lawns because if they are established through sods or sprigs, they thrive. There's different varieties of each one, and these have been genetically bred. But Bermuda grasses, you can mow lower than the tall fescue, 1.5 to 3 inches. Very low water need, low moderate fertilizer need. But if there's any shade, it's no bien. Zoysia, it is shade tolerant, and there's a multitude of varieties that have been bred. And some of them you can mow at 1.5 inches, but most of them for lawns are in the 3 to 4 inch range. But it's very low water usage. It's moderate to pesticide susceptibility. It will get some diseases. And it's a low fertilization requirement. and it's high shade tolerant. St. Augustine, it's very shade tolerant, requires very little fertilizer, moderate pest susceptibility, low water use, but it has to be mowed tall and it's somewhat coarser than some people enjoy if they're active on their lawns. So you have your lawn, you have your plat. We'll talk about the plat originally. And part of that, we want to know the square footage of your yard. So as a homeowner, it's the things I will say that you can do to manage a sustainable lawn for the Lynnhaven and be aesthetically pleasing and allow utilitarian use like social activities takes very few really inputs. But one of them is measure your turf. It doesn't have to be exact, but there will be recommendations that come down later that will say, make a treatment at this many square feet, this many thousand square feet. Usually it's measured in 1,000 square feet. Fertilizer recommendations will be in per 1,000 square feet. If there is a pesticide that needs to be applied, its treatment will be in per 1,000 square feet. And if you're applying it and you know your yard square footage, that makes everything a lot safer and it's better for the Lynnhaven. Doesn't have to be dead exact, but a little 7th grade mathematics and you can get there. So you have, ideally you'd like to make sure you have the right species for your site, but we all know that that's not always the case. You might buy a home and it has a certain grass and you're not ready to reestablish a new lawn and the cost of that. But these grasses can perform well if they're managed well. So the plants all get their carbohydrates from photosynthesis, and that's really the food and energy source. They use that energy to assimilate nutrients from the soil, and there's years and years of research into what balance of those nutrients should be for ideal plant health, and for Virginia actually. So you can take your soil sample, have to Barbara or send it to Virginia Tech, and get an extremely accurate analysis that will tell you exactly how to balance that soil for the type of turf grass that you have. If you balance that soil, then a lot of the challenges that come later, like pests and the inputs and the cost of dealing with them, become minimized. In that soil test, it will make recommendations, and one of the recommendations might be for lime. If your soil requires lime, that changes the pH, and when the pH is in the right balance, then the nutrients are also in the right availability to the plant. So if you get your nutrients balanced and your pH balanced, and it's no harder than sending your test to Virginia Tech or Barbara, then you're going to start to maximize your plant's health. So the next challenge, I'd say measure your yard, measure the amount, the thousands of square feet of turf. You're going to get a recommendation that's going to say how much fertilizer to apply and when to apply it. And I would say there will be folks that say, don't apply a fertilizer to a lawn because it's bad for the Lynnhaven. Well, that would be true if the soil was inadequate availability for that plant, for that turf grass. If it had the right amount of nutrients already, that's great. But if you have an imbalanced lawn soil, then it's going to be susceptible to weeds and disease and pests that will leave it open to bare spots that will erode sediments that will carry nutrients. So if you do apply these fertilizers just like you're supposed to, you'll create this nice little stasis, and we call that sustainability. So when you have your fertilizer analysis and you've measured how many thousand square feet of lawn you have, then you know how many pounds. So it might say, for example, you need to apply 6 pounds per 1,000 square feet. You have 2,000 square feet, so you need 12 pounds. So you get your scale out, get a bucket, and weigh out 12 pounds. We all would love to have your analysis say it's 1457 recommendation from Virginia Tech and go to Lowe's, Home Depot, Taylor's and find a 1457. That doesn't always occur. Get as close as you can. Some of these bags have spreader setting recommendations. Ideally, you'll have your recommendation for your lawn and your rate on the bag and your spreader, but very often that's not the case. But it's still easy. So you measure out the right amount, and as on the right, you put the right amount in your spreader and you set your spreader at the lightest setting you can, and you go over your yard in multiple directions. And it doesn't take long, and you know you're getting the exact right amount. You're not over fertilizing. And that's one thing we want to talk about. Don't over fertilize. These research numbers are accurate. So you apply your fertilizer that way, you take the time and you sweep up anything off the sidewalks, any fertilizers that get on the driveway, and you'll make sure that nothing gets down into the waterway. Another thing about the fertilizers is I like to apply them after the lawn has been mowed, but not ahead of a heavy thunderstorm or heavy rains, because it takes a little time for them to dissolve, find their way in the soil. They bind to the soil if you put them at the right rate, and then the plant can utilize them. But if you put them out ahead of a heavy thunderstorm, then there is a chance some excess nutrients could be leached into the Lynnhaven. So avoid that. The mowing tips are pretty simple. Mowing when the lawn's wet, it's hard for the clippings to fall into the leaf canopy. So we almost always recognize for a home lawn situation to recirculate your lawn clippings. And there's lots of reasons for that. They hold nutrients. So those nutrients will go through a cycle, and your plant will again be allowed to use them again, and you'll be applying less in the future. The other thing about mowing when it's wet is that it can lead to diseases, or it can spread diseases. An additional tip with mowing is never remove more than 1/3 of the height of the grass from its plant, in one cutting. And the reason for that is it shocks the plant, and then it can be susceptible to a disease, or a weed can creep in because it's lost some of its natural defenses. If you've left town and you've been gone for a while and you're going to come back and mow your lawn and you know it's gotten too tall, then take the time to raise your mower, and knowing that 5 minutes you took to raise your mower so you don't cut more than 1/3 off is helping to protect the Lynnhaven. Irrigation. So my wife knows I try to be calm and cool driving down the street when I see sprinklers running in the rain, but it's not easy. And we all see this. And we all know the homeowners, aren't purposely misapplying this. It's just education and a little bit of time and things like that. The power goes out, the timer gets set to another timer. So I have my recommendations for irrigation that are pretty easy. I'm an advocate for an irrigation system. They are fantastic and they are important because your lawn has value. A good lawn increases the value of your home. But the first thing I recommend with someone that has an irrigation system installed is turn it to the off position. It is better to not have your irrigation system in Hampton Roads set to a timer. It's rare that we have those drought periods for so long that your grass could die. It can happen, but it is rare. Generally, allow your lawn to get dry, and when it's dry, turn on your irrigation system, water it, and then turn it back to off. And the reason I advocate for irrigation systems is because they are insurance policies for those times where we do have extreme drought. And I would think an average homeowner can tell when their lawn is too dry. We see different numbers like 1 inch per week. And if you don't get 1 inch per week, generally you'll know when it's too dry. It's just dry out. Everything's dry. Turn on your sprinklers, water your lawn, turn it back off. It will save power. It will save groundwater. Overwatering lawns causes diseases. It's the opposite of sustainability. It's overuse of energy, overuse of resource of groundwater. It spreads diseases, makes the grass sick. So yeah. Other pest control. In general, when you have this lawn and you've balanced your soil, and especially if you have the right grass for your site, you're going to find pest control becomes much more simple. Imbalanced soil, wrong grass, more pests. Balanced soil, right turf grass species, well managed with these simple tips of mowing at the right height, following the soil samples, less pests. The only pest that I will recommend to someone to actually treat on a preventive basis will be crabgrass. One of the challenges is the crabgrass can get into portions of healthy grass. And when it does, or if it does, then it can create a stand of crabgrass or patches. And what happens with crabgrass is it's an annual plant. All your turf grasses are perennial plants. So it's an annual plant that when the frost comes, it dies, and where it was becomes a place for potential erosion. So it could become a bare spot. So I think the idea of applying a pesticide that prevents it, and most of all the crabgrass preventers are safe because they bind to the soil if you follow the instructions on the rate per 1,000 square feet, and they will prevent the crabgrass, that's okay and that's environmentally sustainable because of this area that we live in that has this transition zone that's not ideal for any grass at all times. There's other weeds and diseases, and I'll take questions about them. I'll mention a few later, but Virginia Tech has some resources about that and when to seed and things like that. When we talk about I'm an advocate for having a lawn care provider to take care of the lawn because they have an economic impetus to not over-apply pesticides and fertilizers because they are calculating all the thousands of square feet they treat and they want to treat the least. Now, there might be some occasions where they recommend a treatment that isn't necessary. That's incumbent on the homeowner. We'll talk about that. But the reality is they're going to make a fertilizer application. They don't want to waste it either because they're treating thousands and thousands of square feet. But how to manage your lawn care provider? These are my recommendations. Have them provide you a written program that's for your site. And they should be able to do it, and it doesn't have to be more than a page. Have soil tests. You can have them, Barbara can do them, but they should do them. And that program should be based on your soil test. Any products that they use, have them apply or make available to you their labels and information about them. One thing I recommend too is if you have someone that makes lawn treatment applications, that they communicate with whoever is doing the mowing, because you don't want a treatment and then someone to mow right after. And I've seen that several times. So, and don't hesitate to talk to them about changes in the plant health. And one of the things I will say for you as a homeowner is to provide them patience with scheduling and staff. It's a pain, it's hard. It's hard getting around to all properties, and it's hard training staff. And, we want the cost to be low, but we want well-trained people. So be patient. Be patient with climatic extremes. If it's been stormy, it's stormy all over the area, and your lawn care provider can have their hands full. If you do the mowing and someone does your treating, know when they're going to treat so that you don't go and devalue their treatment by mowing it off. If you treat and someone else mows, then do the same. So, pretty simple, basic recommendations would be to have a plat and create a landscape plan. It's not hard. Have a treatment plan for your landscapes. Use Virginia Tech guides. Like if you have pollen, I'm a big advocate for pollinator patches or water gardens and vegetable patches, and use native plants. Take soil samples, Every 2 years is ideal. Every 3 years is fine. Measure the square feet. Consider how much effort and time you spend and the cost of that, and minimize that. Use native plants wherever possible. So here's some of the things that I know, and this may answer some questions that are coming in advance, I'm not sure. But the things that I see, the challenges, microclimates. You have a north side of a lawn, it might be better for fine fescue, it might be better, and the south side might be better for Bermuda. Consider landscaping your plant, consider the native plants that can go to create that variation. Turf and shade generally don't work that well together, but don't cut down a tree for your lawn. So trees are so vital to holding soil, and they're great for the Lynnhaven, great for carbon sequestration. So the question on aerating and seeding will come up. An ideal lawn should almost not even need to be seeded. And when it needs to be aerated, aeration is to remove compaction. So usually compaction occurs when there's been a lot of traffic, like a football field or golf course with carts riding on it. Home lawns rarely need to be aerated unless they need to be seeded. The reason they are aerated and seeded at the same time is if you need to seed because there's been a problem, then the aeration helps the seed establish quicker. So that's okay. But if you have the right turf, the right soil, the soil's balanced, reseeding and aerating is very uncommonly needed. So Bermuda grass will occur in a tall fescue lawn. A lot of these things occur where I say let nature take its course, because the grass that's most adapted will be the one that has the less inputs required, will also be the one that protects the Lynnhaven. So do you treat a disease like brown patch and tall fescue? It's a pesticide. We don't like to use them. They cost a lot of money. We're kind of scared just to talk about. If you have an extended period of wet weather, then treat your brown patch. Because what could happen is then you could have bare soil, and the erosion is one of the things we want to prevent. So fertilizer options and limitations, I talked a little bit about that. Sprayable and granular weed control. I never recommend a post-emergent fertilizer weed and feed. You'll see weed and feed. And the reason is if you're controlling weeds on a fertilizer granular product, then those granules will fall to the soil and take the pesticide, the herbicide, away from the leaves that it's controlling. So they don't work as well. So maybe I'll wait for questions to talk about doveweed and buttonweed, because I bet that comes up. Clover as a sustainable option as a ground cover. If you can do it, I want to see it, because I'd be all in favor of it. But there's also challenges with that too. But ground cover is important. Minimize inputs, create sustainable ground cover. So, Barbara, what do you think? Questions?
Thank you, Cutler. We have about 20 minutes for questions. And so if you could please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, Cutler will answer those. And any questions that we cannot get to tonight, we will answer by email. So I'm waiting for questions, but I do want to ask you, Cutler, if you could talk about some of those other weeds that are prominent in this area. You mentioned doveweed and
so that's right, doveweed and Virginia buttonweed. Virginia buttonweed is hard to control. So the things I recommend when we talk about making pesticide treatments is I can describe a scenario where you have the right grass and you have the right balanced soil, and you can still get weeds. It's not 100% foolproof, but it skews you in the best way. If you get these weeds and they take over at certain patches, then they're vulnerable to erosion, and that's really bad for the Lynnhaven. So the challenge is controlling. So there's different products, and I am not shy about making a recommendation to control these weeds and say that that can still be good for the Lynnhaven if you do it properly. So doveweed and Virginia buttonweed are two really tough control products, plants, weeds. And tenacity is a great product to use for both of those in tall fescue, but you can't use it in Bermuda grass. The real thing about making pest treatments is take the time to read the label. It doesn't take long. You'll scroll through and it will tell you the rates. And the challenge is calibrating the treatment with a sprayer. So but usually the label will tell you how many per gallon, use fine droplets, follow all the label recommendations. But doveweed and Virginia buttonweed, tenacity is a great product, and tribute total in Bermuda grass. If you have Bermuda grass and you have those weeds, it's another good product, and they're very environmentally safe.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Laura Kirkwood. What are the challenges with clover as a ground cover?
So the challenge for clover as a ground cover is it is a broadleaf plant where turf grasses are monocots. So they're different types, right? So a lot of the weeds are also broadleaf plants, unlike turf grass, but like clover. So if you get Virginia buttonweed, or you get dandelions, or you get a lot of the common weeds, the options to control those weeds are very hard, very slim. If that makes sense. You follow that logic? If we can figure out how to do it, all in favor. We have pollinator plantings in my yard. We don't use insecticides, things like that. So the value of clover, the challenge is if you do get weeds and you get something like wild violet that is very similar to it, that could outcompete it. And then when it dies, you have bare soil, it would not necessarily be good. That doesn't mean there aren't companies looking to research those things. So yeah, that's a challenge, is that clover's too closely related to so many weeds. Is it okay for me to leave the questions on the screen, or would you rather me not? Doesn't matter. Do you see the questions?
Yeah, we have another question from Steve. We have what I call foxtail grass in small patches. I think there's another name for it, but it escapes me. Pernicious stuff. If you know what I'm talking of, how do we defeat it?
So I'm going to say I don't know what you're talking about, because I do know what foxtail is. Now, in foxtail, it's common in gardens or native grass areas that are mow tall, but usually in the turf setting, foxtail has a tough time withstanding the mowing frequency. It's not as adapted. Like if it was a turf grass and it had its management characteristics, its mowing height would be 6 or 7 inches for its ideal. Usually foxtail, so I might think it might be a different weed, but foxtail doesn't like to be mowed. So if it is foxtail, look at the type of grass you have and then mow it at the lowest adapted range for that grass. So I see one, I thought tall fescue lives 3 years, requires reseeding. That's not true. These plants have tillers, and every tiller is a new plant, and they constantly create new plants. And tall fescue can live, it's not like the plant lives for multitudes of years, but the tillers create new plants. Should you use Roundup to eliminate unwanted turf grasses and other weeds? So, no. Not in a turf grass. Oh, to eliminate unwanted turf grasses or other weeds in your lawn. Not in your lawn, because Roundup kills every plant, unless it's genetically modified soybeans. But Roundup, the negative thing about Roundup in our world today is genetically modified foods that receive a lot of Roundup and we ingest it. Roundup is supposedly, I'm going to put some quotes here if you can see me, supposedly degraded by then, and that's fine, and hopefully it is. But as far as you treating your flower beds with Roundup, it's certainly safe. And it's going to be safe for the Lynnhaven because microbes in the soil degrade it very quickly. But as far as treating weeds in your lawn with it, it's going to kill everything that it touches. So I wouldn't think it's good. So dollarweed, let's look at the dollarweed. I hope that answers that one. Dollarweed, I would want to know what it's in. Is it in Tall Fescue or is it in zoysia or Bermuda grass? So Hannah, maybe if you retype that, that will help. Dollarweed should be easy to control if it's Tall Fescue, either tenacity or one of the three-way products that are very common. And I'm sure you, oh, zoysia grass, okay. So that would be, that's a little tougher. Let's save that one for let me write that down answer. Okay, so Hannah, we'll get back to you. 2 swamp milkweeds. All right, I'll go back to Hannah. If it's dollarweed, tenacity, or a three-way product, they're very common to find. And you can go to the store and ask an attendant to let you look at the labels. The label will list all the weeds it controls. So let's see, swamp milkweeds this year, grown huge. You know, I need to ask my wife, she's Madam Butterfly. We have butterflies everywhere in the backyard. She's, I don't know, hundreds this year so far. I think we do cut them down. We put them inside, like the garage, because they don't like the cold weather. I wouldn't cut them back yet. So I'd let more butterfly, let them eat it to the ground. Let the butterflies let the caterpillars do the work.
Also, I think that they'll drop seeds that will grow on the next year.
Yeah, I might not be the best expert on that. A few plants that you'd consider native. Well, I am a turf grass expert. I'm not necessarily, if I get into this realm, there's going to be friends of mine that I know that are tremendously more knowledgeable about all the native plants. But many of our trees, pine trees, oaks, live oaks, things like that. So maybe we should have, let me get one of them to give you a list. And I bet there's a better list than I can give on the LR Now website. Barbara, what do you think? You could probably do better than me on this.
Yes, there is information on our website about native plants, and there's all kinds of native plants. There's shrubs, perennials, and as Cutler said, trees. So all kinds of native plants, and some are flowering and some are evergreen. So there is a lot of information on our website about that. And there's a good publication that's the link is provided on our website that gives you pictures of the plants and descriptions, and that's Native Plants for Hampton Roads.
So St. Augustine that's turned brown and seems to have died. So St. Augustine, I'm gonna maybe ask some questions about this. It really doesn't do well in full sun. Is this an area that's full sun? And that would be a common thing. But St. Augustine does get brown patch. If it happened in August, when we had all that rain, even though you could have the right turf for your site and the right balanced soil, it's still, you can still get diseases. There are a couple fungal diseases that can attack St. Augustine. And so I'm hesitant to say what it is without really seeing it. But one option is to go to Virginia Tech. It's in full morning sun. It doesn't like full sun. And that's, so yeah. But Virginia Tech Experiment Station on Diamond Spring Road, you can take samples there and they can analyze them. But if you remember the slide that had the moss and the sun, it was really obvious. Sometimes I will see that in people's lawns where if they have St. Augustine and the sun really spends a lot of time in certain sections, you will see it in a perfect outline. So make that assessment, and then take your landscape design and maybe reevaluate, and don't try to grow St. Augustine there. So I'll go down to the moss in the back, lots of trees in the back. Try something like zoysia. Maybe I need a soil sample. Definitely need a soil sample. So I would say shade. Yeah, zoysia is a good option. So if it's grown in shade, zoysia or St. Augustine. Fine fescue is a good option in deep shade, but it has to be mowed really tall and it's fragile. But that sounds, a classic thing is to have a backyard with lots of trees. And if the moss is growing there, you know, can you grow more moss? Grow more moss, it's pretty cool. So yeah, try zoysia, St. Augustine, but do a soil sample as well, James.
Okay, Cutler, I think we have time for one more question. And there's a question from T about organic gardening and red clover. It says, I'm doing organic gardening and red clover is used sometimes as a ground cover to add nutrients to the garden soil. Is there something else you recommend, as I don't want to use clover and have it escape to my tall fescue lawn?
Yeah. You know, I'm hesitant to give you too much recommendations, but I'll wing it a little bit. It's to do a soil test even for your garden with Virginia Tech. And then they can tell you things like compost and humus, because they provide tremendous value without the need to add excess fertilizers. So do a soil test and see if there's a recommendation for compost. And there's they actually will measure the organic material there, and you'll fill out a form of what gardening plants that you're trying to grow there. So yeah, I get that, but nice try.
Okay. Well, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you, Cutler, for helping us learn about sustainable yards. On behalf of LR Now, I want to also thank all of the participants for your interest in keeping all of our waterways healthy in Virginia Beach. And I also want to remind you that we offer a detailed lawn plan for your property if you do live in the Lynnhaven River watershed. You can go to www.lynnhavenrivernow.org to apply.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Cutler.